Okay, we are live. Eric Coppolino, welcome to the Terrain Theory podcast.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.
Can you give us a little bit of your backstory, why you are distinctly qualified to be reporting on the events of East Palestine?
Well, I'm one of the few journalists who can draw a through line straight from the events of the 1970s right through to the events of February 2023. I heard the word dioxin for the first time when I was 19 years old, and I was the features editor of a magazine at SUNY Buffalo. And I read that the Love Canal neighborhood in Niagara Falls, where 23,000 tons of chemical and nuclear waste were buried, which had been evacuated 5 years sooner, was about to be resettled by the state of New York. They were going to rehabilitate the Love Canal neighborhood. And I heard that and I thought, well, that's got to be an interesting story. So I went over there and took a look around and then made an appointment to meet with state officials and did my first investigative feature on the resettlement. And I had to learn the entire history of the Love Canal issue. I met Lois Gibbs, which was kind of like Bill Clinton meeting John F. Kennedy in a way. So her, even the small amount of contact, the interviews as a teenager that I had with her in a way shaped my life. And then I did many different tours of duty as a journalist. But then when I was covering public higher education in the early 1990s, there was a transformer accident at SUNY New Paltz, where I was a grad student, and 6 transformers filled with PCB, polychlorinated biphenyl dielectric fluid, which is a form of dioxin, but it's a product, not a byproduct, exploded, burned, ruptured, spewed, made a plume above the ground, below the ground, on the ground. And I basically drove that cleanup to pretty much, I was the only journalist who stuck on it for 3 years and forced them to do a $50-60 million cleanup of 6 different buildings. And so in the course of that, I met the attorneys who were suing Monsanto, Westinghouse, and General Electric in Nevada on behalf of the Nevada Power Company, which we've all seen the Las Vegas Strip. That electricity, that really special electricity that powers the casinos and all that stuff, that power company brought a lawsuit against Westinghouse, Monsanto, and General Electric. And my work was sufficiently good, which means I was like the only person doing it, and I told the truth, that I got their attention and known them ever since. But they started giving me documents from the discovery proceedings of these lawsuits. Right. So therefore, I amassed a collection of 7,500 pages of documents from the files of Monsanto, Westinghouse, and GE. And I maintained, so then I had to learn the other dioxin issue, situations in the country. You learn one, you learn them all, pretty much. And I stayed in touch with Carol Van Strum, my primary contact person. I just talked to her 10 minutes ago. So she's been guiding me and coaching me on this, and I'm about to do a call with the residents of East Palestine, and we're trying to get her on the call as well. And so I've stayed with this issue for many years, and there's not many people left. I'm sure there's some old lawyers. I've been meaning to reach out to Stars and Stripes, which has an archive on Agent Orange. But now East Palestine joins the ranks of this is by far the worst, though, of Nitro, West Virginia, Seveso, Italy, Jacksonville, Arkansas, Love Canal, New York, New Paltz, New York, Binghamton, New York, Five Rivers, Oregon, Bloomington, Indiana, Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It just keeps coming up again. So that's my background. And for 3 years, I've said, well, I'm a dioxin journalist covering SARS-CoV-2, approximately on day 1100.
And Eric, what is dioxin?
Dioxin is a chlorinated hydrocarbon. It is a molecule made of benzene, well, 2 benzene rings. So you imagine 2, I don't run anything round. How about a pair of glasses? That'll work. So now imagine that these glasses are actually hexagonal shaped, and that each point of each hexagon, there's a carbon And there's a couple of hydrogens in there, and then at the middle where the bridge goes, there's one oxygen and another oxygen. That's the dioxin. And then there's chlorine lodged around the outside. This isn't in the diagram. Lodged, or I don't know what it looks like in reality because we can't see it. Lodged around the outside. And so it's a combination of chlorine, oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. And they are the byproduct of any chemical manufacturing process involving chlorine, because there's always hydrocarbons present, for example, bleaching paper. And then they're a degradation byproduct of the extended use of these things and from fires.
Got it. And what does it do to the humans upon contact, and how do we get exposed to this?
Well, we're mainly exposed through food.
Okay.
And then to some extent through air, because there's quite a bit of airborne from municipal waste incinerators and toxic waste incinerators. And then it's not really an issue in water. So the testing of the water, dioxin won't be a good thing to test for. Other things will be. And the health effects range from multi-generational reproductive effects, multi-generational effects generally, that Dow Chemical proved in the 70s that rats would pass it down at least 2 additional generations from the exposed generation. And it is a reproductive toxin in every sense of the word. It is an estrogenic mimicker, so it's a xenoestrogen hormone disruptor. That's the other word for it. It's a very powerful carcinogen. There's pretty much nothing it doesn't do. I mean, it is anti-life. It is the thing that is the exact antithesis to the biological process, but it's so similar in weird ways that it slips itself in, interferes with every biological process, and then it doesn't go away because this molecule is practically indestructible. It is extremely stable. So it moves through the food chain. And here's where this is the perfect terrain issue. In fact, the entire issue of pathogens and viruses is one huge, enormous cover story for dioxin-like compounds. Period. End of story. And so we've been messing around for 3 damned years with a non-existent virus, with people still walking around wearing masks and social distancing and doing all this stuff. And I knew the dioxin issue. I'm thinking, this is insane. This is ridiculous that they sound the alarm for that, but they put the people right back into East Palestine, right back in like 6 days later, 7 days later.
Let's get into that. Can you take us through the events in East Palestine, starting with the initial derailment on February 3rd?
From what I know, a very long train of 150 cars, staffed by 3 people, one of whom was a trainee, had a wheel bearing fail. So this is the root cause of events. When the wheel bearing fails, it catches fire, the axle burns, the train comes off the tracks. So it was on fire 20 minutes before, and I do not know the exact sequence of events that night. It's still kind of foggy. We're putting together the timeline of it, but on the night of Feb 3rd, Friday night, at about 8:54 p.m., this train derails, and it is carrying a cargo that includes 5 tanker cars at least. The early reports were 14, but the final reports of what was dumped and burned are 5 tanker cars full of a chemical called vinyl chloride monomer, a precursor to plastic. Your shower curtain is made of vinyl chloride monomer processed into polyvinyl chloride. So there were about 9 hazmat cars on the train. There were a lot of cars carrying a lot of other toxic stuff that's not considered hazmat, incredibly, like motor oil is not considered hazmat. But of the hazmat cars, 5 were VCM, vinyl chloride monomer, which is a liquid that boils at about 46 degrees. So it's got to be kept pressurized and cold. And so they knew they had a problem with fires around vinyl chloride monomer. I mean, I'm amazed that there's not real planning for what to freaking do about this, or if there was, no one followed it. And they've got some 30 odd cars on fire, and 5 additional cars were filled with PVC, polyvinyl chloride pellets. So the first factory makes the vinyl chloride monomer. Then they ship it somewhere else to make PVC pellets, a very stable, supposedly non-hazardous, right? It's just in pellets, just in a bin. And when burned, also obviously makes dioxin, TCDD, tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, TCDD, same interchangeable. I might refer to it as both. And so they've got burning PVC, they've got burning cars full of everything else like frozen vegetables and wheat, and all of the non-hazmat cars become hazmat when they're burning in the presence of chlorine, because you don't need a lot of chlorine to make the dioxins. You don't need a lot of dioxin to cause a lot of problems, but they've got carloads full of everything else burning. But then the really, really messed up part is, I mean, this is a criminal act on a cosmic scale. The governor was informed that the railroad said, we have to dump the cars or they're going to explode. That is not necessarily a true statement. They only had one car in distress that was redlining, but they were keeping it under control by keeping it wet, keeping it cool. But instead, what they did was they dumped 5 tanker car loads full of, this has got to be like the volume of like 100 massive swimming pools. They dumped this into what they called a ditch. I can't imagine what ditch would contain 5 tanker cars full of vinyl chloride monomer, and they threw a road flare in and ignited it with the informed consent, well, I don't know about informed, but the consent of the governor, who had to have an evacuation order. Pennsylvania was never consulted in this matter. The prevailing winds go east. And so in the middle of the worst possible scenario, they make the worst possible decision and light the VCM on fire in the presence of other hydrocarbons burning. This is why I said this has got to be the worst dioxin plume in history. It might be rivaled by the World Trade Center, but frankly, at this point, I don't think so.
And so here we are, 2 weeks later, essentially. And what are we looking at now?
We are looking at the need to evacuate this town. There should not be anyone in this town who is not wearing a level A moon suit with the air inside the enclosure. There should be no one walking around, taking showers, washing cars, going to school, or doing anything in this town. When proper testing is done, I mean, assuming that people are there, but we need to keep the pressure on to evacuate prior to testing for dioxin. The guys are going to come in wearing level A moon suits. They're going to come in the highest level of protection to take the samples, because they don't want to get contaminated. They know what they're dealing with. So there needs to be an evacuation, which I'm about to call for publicly at a meeting of East Palestine residents. But there needs to be dioxin testing, and it needs to be done right. Water testing for dioxin, useless. Air testing for dioxin, useless. There need to be wipe samples taken off of rooftops. There need to be soil samples taken. The pit was filled in. They need to dig open that pit and go right back to where the fire took place to get a sense of the levels at the point source and immediately surrounding the point source. There need to be 100 test wells drilled, and those wells need to be monitored, because the plume is spreading below the ground, on the ground, in the proximate atmosphere, and in the upper atmosphere. It is coming down as rain. As you say, you can't prove that your child was sick, but this is all revealed in the chronology. This is why the chronologies of these things are so important.
Yeah, and I'll just Eric, I'm going to stop you right there, because that was a detail that you and I covered before I hit record. So I do want to inform the listener that this was some dots being connected earlier today, looking at the timeline, almost forgetting that this thing happened February 3rd, and it was about 4 or 5 days later. And again, we're up in New Hampshire, so you think about those prevailing winds. 4 or 5 days later, that my 6-year-old became sick, and he up until this point in his life, when he would get a fever or get sick, it would last 2, 3 days and he would bounce back pretty quickly. And this one really hit him hard. And he was down and out and not himself for a week, maybe a week plus. Never seen him this lethargic, never seen the symptom set that we saw on him. And we did not put the pieces together until today that, well, I wonder, the timeline seems to match up. But I ask you, does that make sense in terms of like the plume in the air and the atmosphere? Could it have traveled that quickly? How long, what would those symptoms look like? I mean, he had a fever, lethargic, um, coughing, respiratory issues.
They could look like anything, and I assume that you feed him clean
He
food.
he eats clean food, yeah.
Like he doesn't eat a McDonald's every morning, for
Never.
example.
He's
No
never
happy meals or
never had any McDonald's in his
right.
life.
So he's going to be relatively, even though there's uptake in almost everything, including organic foods, relatively low body burden.
Yeah.
So any additional body burden, he's going to feel it. But this is why kids have to be taken out of there immediately.
Yeah.
And you're probably a 12-hour drive from this, right? At least a 12. It's 6 hours from where I am. New Hampshire, well, that's probably a 10-hour drive, right?
Yeah. Yeah, a little bit, maybe a little bit more. Yeah. I'm about 4 or 5 hours away from where you guys are in New York.
And what day did he get sick?
Let's see, February 10th, maybe.
Easily. The
Yeah.
stuff had made it to the East Coast probably within 48 hours.
Oh, wow. Okay. Let's talk through this then. Let's talk about the persistence of the dioxin in the atmosphere. And also I want to know who really needs to be concerned right now. You're calling for the evacuation of the residents of East Palestine, but how far out in terms of like miles radius need to be concerned, and over what, and what can be done?
Well, not much can be done. We've got to get people out of the way. But I mean, in East Palestine, prior to any evacuation order, the pregnant women, the childbearing women, and the kids have to leave. Send them anywhere else, far away. Your cats and dogs should be sent someplace else. Now, most people don't have the means to do this these days. We're very stretched, and the volunteer spirit is not exactly going strong here in the 21st century. But that's the bottom line, pending total evacuation of the town. And then as far as how far out, well, we need to get a grid map of where the plume went. But the thing is that, one of the first laws of nature is diffusion. The things move from an area of greater concentration to an area of lesser concentration. And so over the following weeks, months, years, and decades, this stuff is going to spread everywhere that it did not go, because it's primarily going to be moved by dust and soil above the ground. And below the ground, there's absolutely a plume of all this VC and all the partial burn, but they're going to include dioxins in that, because it just flooded that amount. I can't even comprehend that amount of chemicals. I mean, at New Paltz, we're talking 200-gallon transformers that created a ground plume. From a little flooding, one of the buildings, the pipes froze and it flooded. I mean, the situation in New Paltz, for example, was minuscule compared to this, and it was a very serious situation.
Eric, since we're here in the Hudson Valley, the PCBs were one of the major contaminants in the Hudson River, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. They were the primary problem that GE dumped into the river from Fort Edwards and Hudson Falls capacitor plants.
And God, I mean, I spent some time with Pete Seeger, so I heard a couple things about this over the years. But how was that addressed? Was it dredging? I know that there was controversy over that.
Well, how can you address it? I mean, when you're talking about millions of pounds at the bottom of a sensitive brackish estuary, one of the most beautiful creations of nature in the whole world, what can you do? Now, they did some dredging. They're about to do this Quebec power line going down the Hudson. They're going to stir it up again with the Quebec power line. I mean, eventually, excuse me, they settle. But a lot of communities drink water from the Hudson River, And when they stir this upstream, and I mean right down to the city,
Yeah.
they're going to increase the PCB levels in the water because they slowly become kind of encased in the mud and bind to the mud, and they're heavier than water, so they'll tend to go to the bottom. But with all these chemicals, all these persistent chemicals, you have biomagnification and bioaccumulation. So, it is the ultimate terrain nightmare. I can't even believe that I'd rather be playing my guitar. But I prepared for this moment a long time, and honestly never thought I would ever have to do anything with my knowledge or my documentation. I mean, I really felt like I was playing big band tunes when I would talk about dioxin.
Right.
Eric, you mentioned that dioxin is like the anti-life molecule or compound. And is there nothing that can be done to mitigate this?
Yeah, cutting back exposure. I mean, there's been very little study done of how to reduce levels, and it's very expensive to test for the level. So you really have no way to confirm that you're actually doing it, because these tests can be $1,000, $2,000 each. They're very sensitive assays, and so that's major research to do this. And I imagine there are people who may have some ideas, but once the stuff gets into liver receptors, how do you the AH receptor, among other, how do you purge that? And I'm also concerned there's going to be a cottage industry growing into an industry as big as the phony COVID truth industry to convince people they can detox from this stuff, and giving them herbs and broccoli sprouts and all this stuff when this is not established. And none of us know what to do about it. I know many of the most knowledgeable people on this issue. Nobody knows what to do about it.
So in terms of water testing, like even up here in New Hampshire, I'm thinking about this already. So if the plume reached here and my son was affected potentially by breathing in, there's been rain as well. That's going to get into the groundwater. Like, do I need to be concerned about, and do you, where you are, need to be concerned about well water right now, contamination? How do we, and you said that it's a $2,000 test. Does that include a water test?
It's not a typical test either. I mean, this is not a thing that many labs can do. I doubt there's more than maybe 10 labs in the country capable of doing these. Some of them will be at universities. Some of them will be at places like Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and things like that. So they don't count. When I had to get used to the fact that stuff was in my community and then I had been exposed, you don't want to carry around too much anxiety about it. Mm-hmm. One of the most serious problems facing the whole country is the contamination of farmland and farm animals. I mean, there's 75,000 farms in Ohio. 90% are family-owned farms. There has to be a comparable number in Pennsylvania, though it's more urbanized. So there's a lot of farms right in that area. And then, we're hearing effects in Kentucky, now in New Hampshire. That's it. We're already into half the country here.
And the dioxin persists in the food, right? So if a cow gets exposed, or the vegetables, the soil is exposed, that is going to persist in the food that gets grown in that soil, and then we eat it, and that's another form of exposure.
Yeah, it's the main form of exposure. Yeah. There's uptake, and then it comes out in the milk and the meat.
Okay. Back to water, is there a way to filter this out?
It is probable that using carbon filtration would work.
So this is an active carbon filter?
Yeah. I was on the market for a home, and I checked, I consulted on this issue, and I asked David Carpenter, the famous PCB guy at Albany, and I believe that carbon, you got to have a good one. It's not a Brita, but a real carbon filter is likely to take out most or all of the chlorinated hydrocarbons. You've got to maintain it, but they will get caught in that. They'll bind up with the carbon in the filter.
And what about air filters?
I would recommend that if you're close. I mean, if in East Palestine, I mean, it's kind of a losing battle right now. I mean, unfortunately, it's not that populated of an area. It's not a major city, for example, but Pittsburgh's only 60 miles away. So Pittsburgh is right in the line of the plume. But yeah, I would say air filtration. But look, you open and close the windows. It's a no-win situation. I hate to have to be the bearer of this kind of bad news. And there have been a lot of us over the years screaming about this. We've got to do something about it and get the chlorine out of the economy. That's ultimately, it's a little late, but this could happen 100 more times. Right. So we want to get the chlorine. We need to go back to the idea of the sunset for chlorine.
Eric, there seems to be a discrepancy between what you're reporting on Substack and what the average citizen might read in the more mainstream news outlets. What's going on there?
That's nothing new. This is nothing new. This is, and particularly with dioxin, it's the most suppressed story of them all. So the history of suppressing the story is astounding. And I can give a couple of examples, if that's okay.
Please.
So the two, I think, besides all the gaslighting about it, and they'll have $500 an hour guys there telling you how clean it is, and they'll drink the water and eat the fish out of the river. They'll go catch a trout right now and they'll eat it. Blah 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 blah. Watch them do it though. They won't. Besides all of that and all the regulatory BS, there was a writer. He's still alive. He's quite old, but at the time he was in the peak of his work, named Dr. Peter Montague, who had a publication called Rachel's Hazardous Waste News at the time. It was called. It's a lot more exciting than it sounded. Rachel's Hazardous Waste News, but it was every week. It was fantastic. And fairly early on, around issue 171, he did a piece on dioxin, which quoted a memo, which is on my dioxin resource, called the Sanjor Memo by William Sanjor, one of the honest people at EPA. And let's pray there's somebody in there who's willing to risk his job for this. But the Sanjor Memo was quoted. The Sanjor Memo quoted court documents. These are double privileged documents. You cannot be sued for libel from what comes out of a court document as long as you say it came from a court document. And that's what you're saying. But and what he was reporting was that Monsanto had falsified 3 cancer studies in the 1970s and 1980s, which were based on, in part, on the nitro incident that Monsanto created in Nitro, West Virginia in 1949. And in one study in particular, they rearranged the cohorts. They moved the exposed to the unexposed and the exposed to the unexposed, and they counted part-time people as full-time people and full-time people as part-time people to make sure that the exposed group and the unexposed, quote, quote, groups had the same cancer rate. This is what he wrote about. Monsanto sued him for libel. Not Monsanto, but a scientist who wrote one of these papers named William Gaffey. Paid for by Monsanto, using one of its attorneys, they personally sued Pete Montague for libel. This pretty much put the chilling effect on the issue. But as if that were not enough, a writer at the New York Times, one of their big star 3-piece suit guys who writes on the front page every day, named Keith Schneider, collaborated with CDC to publish a series of 6 front page stories, a major investigative, so-called investigative feature on page 1 that would rivet the attention of the country back when a newspaper could do that. And they said in the lead that some scientists say dioxin is no more toxic than spending a week sunbathing. Sunbathing. Mm. So this convinced now we're talking 30 years ago, with the Pete Montague lawsuit brewing. And by the way, these fraudulent studies have not been retracted, and they appeared places like JAMA. This is not any small time like guy with a lab in his attic producing it. This is serious top level stuff, which is how I was alerted to the fact that, well, maybe the scientific studies on viruses aren't that honest. However, that chilling effect double, the lawsuit and the Keith Schneider series on page 1 of the New York Times, basically shut the story down. To my knowledge, the last serious investigative piece referencing the history of dioxin and the ill-fated reassessment of the toxicity of dioxin that William Sanjor was leading was in the summer of '94 in my cover story in Sierra magazine. And I have not seen one serious piece of journalism in the entire 29 years since that story appeared in Sierra. And I've only heard a couple of local mentions of dioxin in that time. So who knows? When I've been having conversations with chemists, and it's a mutual exchange of information. They don't understand this chemical because it's not really documented anymore. It's not concerned, not written about, not studied. You certainly can't make the stuff, right? You can't really like demonstrate it in chemistry lab. And so I'm telling them about the dioxin issue, and they're telling me about how the molecule is structured and whether it's ionic or covalent and all this, right? So we're having an even exchange of information. It's pretty intense. Yeah.
Are there studies out there that folks can research that point to the detrimental effects of dioxin on the human?
Yep. On my Substack, I have a lot of that, but I just added a moment ago several chapters from a report that my friend Carol prepared for Greenpeace in 1987. So this is like, old timey, but it's typewritten and it's up there, and it's called No Margin of Safety. And that is a compendium of all that was known by the EPA and the corporations until 1987. And things have only gotten worse since then. But it is there. It is footnoted. It is impeccably written. Carol and Paul they're the Baileys of this issue. Mark and Sam. Their research is impeccable, and it's available right there. So this is at planetwaves.org, and I'm leaving this piece pinned, the dioxin resource for journalists and citizens, that includes like my top 10 or 12 best resources.
Okay. What occurs to me, something that you said at the top of the episode, that this is like the ultimate terrain incident, the ultimate terrain conversation. And as I reflect on our experience with my 6-year-old as he was going through this, bringing him to urgent care, the various nurses and physicians who saw him all right away went, well, we're going to test
virus.
we're going to test for influenza A, we're going to test for COVID. This is what's going around right now. And so, we talk about the no virus camp. COVID, you've been reporting on for the last, 2+ years,
1,100 days.
Yeah, I mean, are we looking at one of the potential like culprits for any pandemic? I mean, most of the sicknesses that we're seeing, we talk about this. We ask this question: what really makes us ill if there are no viruses? And it sounds like dioxin is a pretty good candidate.
Dioxin and all of its cousins, right? That includes a wide diversity of other so-called forever chemicals, and DDT is still bouncing around the environment as if it never went away. PCBs in many kinds, glyphosate. The history of viruses is the history of covering toxins. So they contaminate the planet. Mike, you've heard the story before. I mean, I'm trying to think of the name of this author. I have trouble remembering names when I'm in the middle of speaking, but he wrote the book on AIDS. That was another Peter. Peter
Duisberg.
Yeah. And he spends the first 100 pages of his book. I mean, it's masterful. 100 pages. You got to get through 100 pages of this book where he's telling you every time that a toxin was blamed on a virus or a bacterium.
Mm-hmm.
And then on page like 101, he starts talking about the problem with the false claim of HIV causing anything. So this is pure Rockefeller medicine. And look, all these chemicals are petroleum chemicals, and Rockefeller is Standard Oil, is Flexner, is the AMA, is the entire paradigm of medicine that we live in, which is virus injection. One cause, one injection. Another cause, another injection. On and on and on. And so I'm deeply concerned that these toxins are being spread in a largely injected population.
Yeah.
The reason you don't do that, and the reason, people, people like have these debates about terrain theory, and it's nothing more than your grandma saying, "Take care of yourself.
Yeah, I
Right.
know.
Don't eat that crap."
No
That's
shit.
terrain theory. That's it. Don't drink McDonald's shakes. So it is the simplest theory in the world. The
Yeah.
problem is it's a background theory, right? It's a figure ground, right? Ooh, COVID. Like they draw these molecules with all the little things coming out of them.
Mm.
That's the figure. It's like that's like the dancing skeleton on the stage. But the stage is everything else, and people don't notice the ground usually. It's invisible. It's often imperceptible without a disruption event like this. So, oh, this is why we shouldn't have spent 3 years perseverating over a virus and putting 10 billion injections into people's arms and locking down the entire world for a freaking claimed respiratory virus when they had announced their plans in October. This is pure psychosis, and so we're seeing what that covered for. We're seeing what that covered for.
Thank you for drawing that, making that impossible to miss. What's the rude awakening for me right now as well, there is this event that has taken place, this catastrophic toxic bomb that's just gone off. It's reminded me though that there are, as clean as I try to eat, as conscious as I have become, it's what's right under our feet that I'm still like blind to. I'm still not accounting for. I live in the Hudson Valley, the PCBs in the river. What's even in my garden beds? It's like you can't be diligent enough because we're up against so many decades of assault, honestly.
Yeah. Yep. And
so at what point, at
no.
what point does it, it's one thing to brush something under the rug or do a bait and switch, but at what point do you say like we're just under attack?
Oh, we are. I mean, first of all, the chemicals containing dioxin are chemical weapons. Most of them. Agent Orange is a chemical weapon. And when it was banned in Vietnam, it was imported and sprayed on roads in the United States, and you can still buy it at Tractor Supply and Agway it's called +2. It's weed killing fertilizer. It's 2,4-D. There's two components to Agent Orange. 2,4,5-T, since banned. 2,4-D, not banned, contaminated with dioxin. So you can go right into Hannaford or Winn-Dixie and buy yourself some Agent Orange, just like that. And as if Roundup Ready crops were not enough, Monsanto, which is if there's Satan, it's Monsanto. I mean, they're engineering 2,4-D resistant crops, and they're spraying them with both. So this is a chemical weapon attack on the civilian population, but people spray it in their yards, and I walk up to everyone I see spraying Roundup and I say something once, like I walk up to everybody, I meet every dog that crosses my path. If I can arrange it. Maybe if it's up the street too far and I can't catch up, fine. But that still leaves a lot of dogs that come into my proximity. And if it's got a flea collar, I warn the owner, this is going to kill your dog. And people, most of them, well, it's like 50-50. Some will say, well, funny, I was looking that up last week. And some tell me Lyme disease, go fuck yourself.
Right.
Basically. And so the way to deal with this release is you've got to throw the chemicals out in your house. You get rid of all your conventional shampoos and stop using chemical deodorants and minimize exposures, and cleaning products and disinfectants are the worst. Some of the worst dioxin releases in American history, probably actually world history, have been through Lysol disinfectant and a cleaner called Physohex, which was replaced by Physoderm because the hexachlorophene was taken out, but there's still triclosan. These are all Monsanto products on the market. So get all that stuff, hand sanitizers, cleaning chemicals, all this stuff. You need soap and water, Dr. Bronner's soap and vinegar.
Yeah.
Basically, I use a dog pee thing that I have to, but I don't think it's that bad. And it's not fucking Lysol. It's not Lysol.
Eric, you've been covering moments like this for decades now, and we're going to enter into the realm of speculation a little bit, but based on your experience with how these things unfold, what can we expect from mainstream news, from the politicians, from the EPA? What can we expect moving forward coming out of this event?
Well, the game is the authorities will deny, 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 deny. I and we are doing our best, to punt the issue into play. So we've got the dioxin issue. I mean, my Substack post on this had like 60,000 reads. It's crazy. I don't, nothing. It's like combine all my other posts combined. So there is an interest in this issue.
Yeah.
And so I'm doing my best to spike the issue and inform my brothers and sister journalists to be keen to the issue. And then it's going to come down to largely who owns the publication. It's going to come down to issues like, are the editors savvy? Did anyone have a relative in Vietnam who understands this kind of a problem? But I'm seeing at least the public being warmer to this issue than it was to any questions about so-called COVID at the beginning, when you were considered a heretic who should have been burned at the stake for even questioning Tony Fauci, which should have cautioned everyone that there was a problem. Let's at least talk about it. So,
yeah.
Just a quick aside, I was typing the word Fauci into a text the other day.
Oh no.
Because I worked on a song with Jude Roberts. It's sort of a anti-Fauci.
I know the song.
Parody song, Fall on Your Sword, Dr. Fauci. Yeah, we recorded that here in our studio.
Got it.
So anyway, I was writing Fauci. I was writing to Celia, and autocorrect turned Fauci into, no, I'm telling the story backwards. I was writing the word faith, and it fucking autocorrected to Fauci.
Come on, Fauci has an autocorrect? There's predictive text to predict Fauci's name? Come on. Yeah. But I want to know how COVID got into predictive text before this thing happened, and how it capitalizes. And since when do we capitalize a disease? You don't capitalize diabetes or heart attack, but COVID suddenly is capitalized.
Yeah. Eric, how does this compare to other events? You've mentioned 9/11 and the towers coming down. People talk about Chernobyl. How does this compare?
Well, every one of these top tier events is in its own league. Chernobyl, we're still consuming that radiation. Fukushima, we're still consuming that radiation. 3 Mile Island, these poor people in Pennsylvania have had more than their share. It is up there with the very worst dioxin releases in history. How it would compare to an incinerator that was running for 40 years, no, but that's not the same thing. And there's no way to really measure this. And I was warning about dioxin in the World Trade Center pile like on September 12th. And I think I might have been the only person. I've tried to go back in the Wayback Machine and find this unsuccessfully. But I mean, I had a dioxin warning on page 1 of Planet Waves. It is up there with the World Trade Center, but the problem is, I think this is going to be worse, because there was so much, it was solid, pure PVC and VCM and God knows what else, with stuff like motor oil and other stuff burning, sheet metal. I mean, this is like Love Canal above the ground.
Yeah.
Love Canal was 23,000 tons of waste. And you wouldn't think, after all these years, and I do hope to go back and visit it, could there be something worse? Well, yeah, you take 23,000 tons of waste and you put it on a train above the ground and you just burn the whole thing. Right above the ground. So it's all like released in a gigantic plume up to like 30, 40,000 feet, where it can go anywhere. I can't even believe we're having this conversation.
And if I'm not mistaken, this was sort of ground zero for the Amish community as well.
That's what I've heard.
Right.
I mean, people are asserting things that I will not get behind. I have no evidence this was intentional sabotage, but burning that VCM was an absolutely insane and uninformed decision. And if they had to mount a Chernobyl-like response to that, with every fire department for 200 miles bringing its pumper trucks, that's what they should have done, and kept that thing cool until they could get that shit out of that one car. The other four cars, to the best of our knowledge, I've got people working on this. There's a lot of details going by that I have not assembled yet, but to the best of our knowledge, there was only one car of VCM in distress, and they dumped and burned 5.
Eric, how much of this stuff is going through backyards and people don't know it? You know, how much of this is being transported across the country on rails?
Normally, I mean, there's a background level. I mean, there's a background level pretty much everywhere. There's a background level in every person.
I mean, how much is being transported by rail? You know, through the person's backyard in any state.
These chemicals?
Don't know. Yeah.
I mean, the trains I hear at night all the time. I mean, I stopped at a train crossing. I mean, I pulled a U-turn to get stopped at it, and I was going the other way to photograph it. But there was like 60 tanker cars or 50 tanker cars. The thing went by for 4 or 5 minutes, clipping along at 50 miles an hour. That's a mile of tanker cars, nothing else but tanker cars and a locomotive pulling it. So this could happen anywhere. And the railroad industry is basically, thrown regulation to the 4 winds. They're working on braking systems invented 200 years ago or 160 years ago. The same type of system, air brake systems. The inspections are terrible. The regulation is down to nothing. And then we've got these roving love canals waiting to blow up, and it could happen anywhere that cargo trains go.
Are you aware of organizations, activist organizations that are trying to get rid of these, like the chlorine from the economy? Who's doing the work to try to get rid of this stuff?
I haven't heard a peep about the chlorine sunset for 30 years. That idea came and went, but we need to revisit it. I mean, with the possible exception of manufacturing pharmaceuticals, where an argument could be made that they're necessary, they've got to be eliminated. They've got to be sunset. And we're going to have another way to make plastic. But why the hell are we pumping all this oil out of the ground to make plastic? And this stuff in this train was going to be put into car vinyl and mobile homes and plastic figurines and Stretch Armstrong dolls or whatever.
Yeah, even today, I was buying some cables for the studio here, and I was just looking down the specs and some of the ingredients, and PVC was right in there.
Yeah.
Sort of hit home. I mean, it is pervasive in everyday objects. But of course, I also visited my friend Melissa at Hemp and Humanity yesterday, and she sent me packing with a hemp plastic fucking bottle opener. So it's doable.
Yeah. It's doable, but plastic's hard to recycle, and they haven't invented an easily recyclable plastic. These chemists are brilliant. Chemistry is my favorite science, besides marine biology, and they're closely related. But in terms of like a science that's just exciting, chemistry is exciting. And these people are geniuses. They can make any molecule they want. They can figure it out. They can figure out how to make a recyclable plastic that just can be used over and over and over again, melt it down, put it back into things, and they have not done that.
It's not for lack of imagination. It just cuts into the bottom line.
Yeah, they certainly have the imaginative power they got us to this point. I mean, it took a lot of imaginative power to be able to make this thing. This is a feat of technology. This Zoom meeting is a feat of technology.
Right.
So they can do anything that they want. And look, though, that I think the railroad made $10 billion in profits last year. So all it's doing is making the rich richer. All it's doing is paying dividends to multimillionaires and hedge funds.
Mm-hmm.
BlackRock owns a massive amount of the stock in this railroad. Chase owns a massive amount of the rest of the stock. All it's doing is making money for people who already have too much.
Eric, you are, after this conversation, you are going to be addressing the people of East Palestine, and you said you're going to encourage them to evacuate.
Yep.
My question is, do you feel that they currently have the support of their state and the federal government to evacuate and know that they've got a safety net below them?
At this point, they don't, and the authorities are unlikely to ever concede that until they are forced. Until someone starts picking up dioxin on rooftops, they will always deny the problem until the last second. The last words out of their mouth will be, "It is perfectly safe," until they're handed the test results that they themselves did, which prove that it is not safe. On this week's Planet Waves FM, in the last segment at planetwaves.fm, it's the first program up at the moment, Carol Van Strum tells a story where I'm not sure what, it was an EPA official who testified about dioxin samples that he said, well, they're lost, or they're confused, or mixed up, or the samples got lost, or whatever. But she had obtained those samples that morning, the results called Table 7, because her attorney took a chance, and there were only 4 labs that could do these tests besides Dow Chemical itself. And he took a 1 in 4 chance and got the lab tech on the phone, who faxed him the results on the spot, and she had them in court. And so the EPA gets up there and lies under oath. And then the next person to take the stand was Carol, and she had Table 7, and she handed it to the judge and to the press and to the public, and then began a game of, oh, those were the wrong samples. Those really weren't from Oregon, those were from the Midwest someplace. And so this four more years of litigation prove the provenance of those samples. I mean, so this is a very, very long game, and I am concerned that society has been softened by overexposure to digital conditions, the complete destabilization of intellect, and the upheaval of culture, and the idea that nothing is true. There's already people saying this is a false flag, it never really happened, and all this. I mean, just to defuse that, I called the local aviation company to get an estimate of how long it would take to fly me out over this thing so I could photograph it and come back, so I can say, yeah, I saw it. But I talked to a guy today 5 miles away who owns property 100 feet from the tracks.
To verify, yeah. Well, nothing is real anymore. Right.
Nothing is real anymore. The Earth is flat, and that's all an extreme digital fantasy. People are living in a digital world where they themselves have been uploaded. And so I am concerned that there's not really the intellectual muscle to put together the logic or to respect the people with acquired knowledge. I'm amazed that my work has gotten the attention that it's gotten on this. I type that, like I think a lot of things start on the internet. I just type that up on Saturday morning because the fire chief in East Palestine hung up on me 3 times. A guy answering the phone on the fire was probably the chief. I don't know, it may not be a very big fire department, but whoever answered the phone to the fire department hung up on me 3 times. And I said, I have got information for you. Sorry, we don't need it. We've had a million calls. I don't sound like a crank. I know how to handle myself. And so I opened the show with being hung up on 3 times by the fire department. And after that, I'm like, I got to get something together. So it didn't take very long. I just basically, I had just written the obituary for a friend on this issue who had died the previous week, Ward Stone, and his obituary is on my Substack. I can move it up a little bit, but you'll find it. And he was one of the people we need now. His kind of personality, where he was a state official for the Department of Environmental Protection, and the whole DEP could be giving one bullshit line, and he would show up with his test kits and take the sample and run it through a separate contract and follow through and get the schoolyard cleaned up. That's how I got the vents cleaned up at SUNY New Paltz. Was he gave me sample jars, and I went and I took apart a vent. I got let into the building at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning and took apart a vent and proved that it was contaminated. So we need people like that, and I'm afraid that the lawyers are going to start circling in, and the snake oil salesmen selling holistic cures for dioxin are going to come circling in, and this is happening before the simple message, find somebody somewhere and get the fuck out. We need a network of people around the country who can take these. There's a lot of people with extra homes, big homes, We've got to get these people out of there and figure out what to do with them.
How big a radius do you suspect people should be evacuating from?
That's impossible to say. I mean, I would at least start with the town and the
Yes.
surrounding villages.
Right.
Let's just start with that. And this includes in Pennsylvania. This was only a couple of miles from the PA line.
Right.
I mean, this is tragic and no one wants to hear this. And, you know, I've gone up against the community on this issue at the campus, and I was accused of wanting to close the campus down. I never even said that, but they knew that I could do it. They knew, and something like just last year, I talked to one of the people who was the president of the faculty senate and a county chairman of the county legislature, who went out to lunch, and he was the person who was being consulted by the college president, and he told me over lunch 30 years later how close I came to closing down the entire SUNY New Paltz campus. So I will tell you that citizen action can work. We've got to get out of digital consciousness. We've got to get on the ground, stay together, love each other, and you have to have fun doing it. Now, this is very hard to say to people whose lives have been completely upended, but you've got to keep the vibes positive, because you'll be worn down in a minute if you don't. And you'll hear Carol, and she is wicked funny about this. And thank God there are a few people left who can help advise and court. I'm nervous as all get out that I'm going to be going before East Palestine resident Palestine. I don't think I've ever been more nervous about anything except playing my first gig.
Well, on that note, I want to give you time to hop off this call, prepare for that one. And before we go, though, if you could just let the audience know where they can learn more about you and follow your work.
Planet Waves websites .org will take you to my Substack. It's a really nice Substack. .fm will take you to my radio program. And if you're an astrology fan, .net will take you to my astrology website. Now, how does the prosecuting investigative reporter also write a horoscope column? And someone should ask me that in an interview. Well, after 3 years of covering dioxin at SUNY New Paltz, I was freaking fried. I was absolutely fried with the bad news. And I had just inherited a little bit of money, not a lot, but a little, and I took the winter off. And so I had developed an affinity I have always had spiritual leanings, but then the astrology bug kind of bit me, and I started diving into astrology, this kind of like the last quiet time in my life that I remember. And I emerged from that writing a horoscope column, and that's what I've done. And that's how I support myself. So, and a staff of 10. So it's a great horoscope column, but that's .net. .org is the Substack. That's a shortcut. It'll take you right to the Substack. And .fm is a radio program that I've done on and off since '98 when I started on Radio Woodstock. And I've done many discussions of environmental issues. I've got the best ones pushed to the top of the feed. The show's designed to be low key and mellow, kind of like your vibe here. Though I'm sure I brought a little cortisol into the environment tonight.
better cortisol than dioxin. Eric, we will put the links down in the show notes of the episode, and we appreciate you coming on, taking some time to share your knowledge and wisdom on this topic. And we hope that your message continues to spread far and wide. We hope that the people of East Palestine heed your warning, and that this perhaps serves as the rally call for the entire country, if not world, to take more action. So we thank you again for coming on.
Benjamin, Michael, thank you both. And to everyone listening, thank you.